Hi, everyone. It's 1 p.m., so we're going to get started. My name is Carissa Coro, and I'm from the Center for Collaborative Education in Boston. Our organization is working with Vermont Professional Learning Network at the Vermont Agency of Education this year. The network offers numerous professional learning opportunities during the year. Today's session is part of a three-part series to meet with one of the Digging Deep Expert Series presenters, Allison Zmuda. An electronic copy of today's slides, as well as additional resources, are available on Allison's Learning Personalized landing page, which I'm going to put in the chat box momentarily, but it's also on your screen. Speaking of the chat box, if you're attending with a group, could you please type in all attendees in the room with you in the chat box? We're excited to bring Allison to Vermont to share her expertise and perspective on personalized learning. I'm especially excited because when I first started in education, Allison was one of the technical partners who helped us in our UBD journey. Yeah. Allison is co-author of Students at the Center, Personalized Learning with Habits of Mind, and has written a host of other books and articles on education focused on backwards design, assessment practices, student voice and choice, and equity over the last 2 decades. This webinar series will lead up to Allison's 2-day event, which is on May 2nd and 3rd at Lake Morey. Today's topic is around assessment. With that, I'd like to turn over the conversation and give a warm welcome to Allison.
Hello, Carissa. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I am so looking forward to meeting Vermont educators on May 2nd and 3rd, and especially getting to reconnect with Carissa in person. And I just want to give clarity that the slides are on the landing page. So what I call the landing page is learningpersonalized.com/digging-deep. So if you can click on that, you'll see all 3 of the webinars that we've done. This is the 3rd in a series of 3. And also just a couple of things that I have continued to come across, both in conversations with Carissa, but also doing some digging of my own and featuring Katie Farber in this particular session on the landing page with 2 fabulous posts that are also inspiring some of the slides that I did in the presentation, as well as the Tarrant Institute, who I've been hanging out with on Twitter for a couple of years now, and I'm thrilled to continue to see the powerful work that they're doing. So with that, we will get the slide deck started. So hopefully everybody can see. And then, like I said, you can also take a look at that landing page there. That's the URL link. And I think it's also being put in the chat box as well if you need to get that from there. All right, so this is focusing on student-led assessments and the idea and the magic of what can happen when students have an opportunity to be the designers and co-creators of their own learning experience. And when you're imagining designing a student-led assessment, we want to go right to the idea that this is something that many folks are intrigued by, but how do you get started, and what kinds of challenges might you face, and what are the criteria for what quality looks like? So we'll start with this inspiration. The first part of inspiration is really grounded in the environment and the local community, your neighborhoods, your local towns, the state of Vermont, trying to really pay attention to and think through and figure out what is it that is all around us that can inspire problems, challenges, and ideas. So that kind of interaction with the environment really gets kids connected. They get students being able to start paying attention to things like problem identification. So when we're immersed in the idea of design thinking, the first step is listening with understanding and empathy. What are the problems and challenges that a neighborhood is facing or a family is facing? What are the problems or challenges that the local board is facing? And trying to think through and figure out what I can do about it. We're really trying to, in that second bullet, inspire your students, not only as deep thinkers, but also action makers, really that they can actually have impact regardless of whether they're 5 or 15. So the act of creation, the act of service, the act of doing something on behalf of a broader problem, challenge, issue, or idea, that level of creation and action really creates a very different kind of ownership. And finally, inspired by the deep knowledge of a subject or multiple subjects, it's incredibly important for the idea that we make sure that the experience is rigorous in nature. We want to make sure that we're doing this in a way that's consistent with the state frameworks, as opposed to just being something that's only can be relegated or thought of as a co-curricular or an optional experience. And so really trying to pay attention to the intersection between the content territory that we are the stewards of leading the experience around, but at the same time really trying to step back and say, how can we make it as meaningful, authentic, and relevant as possible? And much of the time, they actually can coexist. So when we're moving a little bit deeper, I want to talk about the territory for criteria for a student-led assessment. And by the way, this criteria is something that was really inspired by the Understanding by Design work with Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. And so some of this language really does resonate back to those Understanding by Design constructs. So the first piece is thinking about that a student-led assessment should really be an application of knowledge and skills, not just recall, meaning that we want kids to be able to demonstrate a level of thinking. They're having to identify a problem or a challenge, but also they're trying to be strategic in what knowledge and skill do they already possess and starting to use that to make deeper sense of it. But at the same time, they're also paying attention to the idea that there may be territories of knowledge and skills that they don't have yet. So even identifying what those knowledge and skills look like are something that does require a level of thinking and conversation. So one of the examples that I saw in the Brainado concept, which is an example that'll be featured a little bit later on in the presentation, of building a hovercraft. And so if you're thinking about building a hovercraft, there are so many subject areas that are directly connected to that. So for this team of middle school students, what are the kinds of questions or challenges? And how can I figure out how I can start to build this, but at the same time, really start thinking about the resources or networks that I need? The second aspect is really making sure that it is open-ended, so that it doesn't create this step-by-step procedure. The intention is that any of these student-led assessments really do have false starts and dead ends, having the opportunity for students to regularly step back and reflect on not just progress monitoring, but is this the best way to continue to proceed? So there are lots of moments for them to really try to grow their thinking flexibly, for example, in that particular space. The third piece is thinking about establishing authentic context for performance. It means that we're starting to think about the genres or forms. So we're doing work that we can also see examples of in the world outside of school. So we're developing architectural blueprints to continue to conceptualize my idea of a tiny house. And again, students, when they're starting to see the consistency of the authentic context for the performance, they're starting to become more intrigued by that particular career or career set, but also they're being more intrigued to look at examples both within the school space, but also outside the school space. The next piece is providing an authentic audience and form. And the notion of audience is really trying to make it so that this is a community-based enterprise. So the opportunity for an expert like an architect, as we were just talking about architectural blueprints, to have an authentic audience come in and give feedback and guidance very early on in the process when the students potentially need the most help when they're starting to initially engage in that drafting. And it's a really interesting idea of what is the right moment to bring outside experts in, whether it's virtual or a physical visit or a place-based experience. The next piece is the opportunity to frame the challenge, problem, question, or idea. And this is really the power of what happens when you're engaged in design thinking, for example, or you're engaged in project-based learning. I don't know if folks know about the high quality project-based learning that just got launched last month, but the examples of the high quality project-based learning is really designed to make it so that students are partnering with teachers more than ever before to engage in that enterprise. The next piece is thinking about the design approach, thinking about what kinds of checkpoints might I need. And again, this is something that is, yes, a feature of project-based learning and design thinking, but it's also a feature we can continue to integrate into any classroom, but we're doing it in consultation with the students as opposed to identifying that on their behalf and they're following our lead. And finally, the idea of including criteria or rubrics, where students actually have a role in the evaluation of their own learning, both in the design and the development of it, but also they can actually have a seat at the judging table. So that's really the territory of what we're going to explore in this webinar, but also hopefully this one slide might be a helpful list of criteria that you can print out and begin to use in reflecting on your own existing student-led assessments, but also continuing to grow an aspect of that in your classroom experience. So this is not the first time you've seen this. I think this has been showing up in hopefully every single webinar that I've done. We're paying attention to the idea that as we start to personalize, we're increasing the level of ownership and engagement from a student point of view, but we're also increasing the level of accountability and responsibility and task management. And so the idea and sort of the holy grail of having students be as self-directed as possible when, especially when you're engaged in a student-led assessment, it is absolutely vital. And so oftentimes we may design projects, for example, but not necessarily give them the coaching around the thinking, the sophisticated skills that they are struggling to demonstrate as a part of the process and engaging of the project. And so those are the most meaningful moments from a classroom teacher and a student point of view, that the project becomes more meaningful, more substantive, more important when the student continues to get feedback from the teacher on their current level of performance, as well as thinking about it with the teacher as a soundboard, thinking through feedback and guidance and next steps. And so when you're thinking about student-led assessments, the 4 attributes of personalized learning are most significant. So when it comes to voice, and again, let's play this language out through the lens of student-led assessments. When it comes to voice, we are absolutely reliant on students to identify what they find to be interesting, problematic, things that they're passionate about. And the intention is that when we're listening to students, we are demonstrating the habit of listening with understanding and empathy. So we give them space to play out their statements or ideas or concerns or challenges, but also we try not to make the challenge go away. We ask them probing and reflective questions to continue to help their thinking, because the goal is not just to finish the project. The goal is actually to learn from the experience. So oftentimes when we're really paying attention to the idea of listening with understanding and empathy, because they're using their voice, they're starting to uncover with you potential solutions to their own problems, challenges, and ideas. That dovetails nicely with the idea of co-creation. And co-creation is really integral in student-led assessments. The teacher is helping identify that problem and challenge and parameter, but at the same time, we're really looking for students to be partners with us in the design. And trying to really just think about that balance of it not being something that is totally independent from any kind of teacher guidance or structure. For example, if we want to make the standards a meaningful part of it, we have to step back with the student and say, I love this idea that you want to do a deep dive in the study of contaminated water in our local community. But at the same time, what is it that you're after? So we can start taking a look at the state frameworks to identify and consider what are the scopes that are reasonable and important for them to play out as part of that enterprise. So we're moving to social construction. And social construction is, again, the ability from a student-led assessment point of view to seek out expertise. We're growing networks, not just people, but networks of collaboration. Again, many of the problems that we're faced with in the world today require a level of collaboration to think through not just the problem, but potential solutions. And so the ability to present yourself in a professional manner, again, whether you're 5 years old or 15 years old, is important. And we need to make sure that we're spending enough time and attention on that so that students begin to feel comfortable with engaging with adults or other children that they may have reached out to or connected with in the local community or a community that's halfway across the world. And finally, self-discovery. Self-discovery when it comes to student-led assessment is absolutely vital because the notion of a growth mindset is important. And if students feel defeated because the challenge might seem too hard at this moment, or the text feels too difficult or dense, how can we continue to grow that level of sophistication in our students, as well as the opportunity to step back and grow their level of self-advocacy skills? But the idea of really trying to think about these 4 attributes is a driving frame as we move through. So the territory that we're in when it comes to looking at 2 of the 7 elements, we're going to pay attention to task and audience, and then we're going to take a look at evaluation as the second piece. So when we're thinking about task and audience, if you can read from left to right, that would be fabulous. I'll give you a moment to do so. So from a teacher-generated point of view, you can do really substantive performance assessment work, but oftentimes the teacher is identifying one or a handful of choices for the students to select from. And again, it is something that is powerful, especially when students are struggling to think about what might be powerful application examples or forms. It's a very helpful way to begin to move on the soundboard. But as we're starting to move over to the right, we're having teachers identify possible forms, but we're doing it in a way to inspire student choice. So we want to make sure that the students, if they have a good idea of how to feature this, they have an opportunity to engage and do that. The other aspect of co-creation is really paying attention to the idea of audience. And the audience really can be something that is preordained or designed. It can be a captive audience, like a group of kindergarten students as an audience as a second grader, where I might have to take a topic and make it come alive for that kindergarten class. Or it might be actually more open. I can test out something to see how it plays out with different people. So when we're looking at the last part, really we're starting to pay attention to the idea that form and audience are really driven by what is best given what the purpose of the assignment is. And the opportunity for students to be engaged in that experience of really thinking through, might I actually shift the form or the audience, because I'm continuing to go in a different direction in my research, or I'm starting to create something that's new that wasn't something I expected to do. So there is this level of back and forthness between the idea or the problem or the challenge and the task and the audience. And so trying not to get the students so fixed on the form and the audience initially actually is quite helpful if you're starting to move all the way to the right. So it's lovely to talk about these ideas, but let's talk about some practical examples in relation to these ideas. So this is a great example. It's called Value Added, and it was drafted by a group of teachers in Hartford High School in Hartford, Connecticut. So I would love for you to take a quick read. And when you're taking a look at this, trying to pay attention to what is this assessment truly after, and where might it live on the soundboard spectrum. So initially, as you're reading it, you can start to see that it feels a little bit bossy. When you're starting to see the specific bullets of surveying the area and interviewing people and propose and get approval for the project and develop a plan of action. But there are other aspects of it that are quite open. So the notion and the purpose of this is that they're trying to create something that contributes to the aesthetic beauty and health of a place or community. Because oftentimes we engage in community projects to do just that, but the upkeep of that once the ribbon is cut or once the project is finished, the upkeep is actually something that is not treated well. So the notion of graffiti showing up on a mural that took 3 months to create, or the idea of planting a community garden that gets overrun by weeds in the first couple weeks. It's distressing, but also really trying to think hard about what is appropriate for that community and how can we include people from the very beginning in that community to make sure that this is something that A, will add value, and B, something that is sustainable after the paintbrushes and the gardening supplies are gone. So the territory here, if we can go back for a minute, it would be interesting to reflect on where might it live on the soundboard. So when you're starting to pay attention to this, you can start to see that it really lives in this kind of co-creation space, potentially a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right of that bright line in the middle. And the reasons for that is that the possible task forms as suggestions might be really helpful. So what I said as a community garden or a mural are two really good examples, but I'm sharing that to inspire the ideas around the room. I'm not saying you're choosing from one of these suggestions. I think the second piece is that the audience might be fixed or might be open. Depends on the grade levels of the students, but also really trying to think about things like safety and security. And as part of the world of school, we do need to pay attention to that. So we can actually continue to move it a little bit to the left, to a little bit to the right, depending on comfort level depending on level of connections with nonprofits in the community, etc. All right, so let's look at another example. Here's a wheelchair ramp example. I want to, again, give you a moment to take a quick read. So as you're starting to see that this wheelchair ramp is going after multiple subject areas. There's definitely science involved, there's math involved, there's English language arts involved. But the opportunity to think about doing something that adds value for a community is incredibly important. And again, being able to actually do this as opposed to it being a hypothetical exercise changes the game completely. I also wanted to feature a couple of examples that I hung out and found on Twitter. So featuring two concrete examples. One comes from the River Valley Technical Center, and starting to just take a look at that picture of how we're paying attention to understanding an accident investigation. So the engagement of the students is really grounded in the setup of the problem, but it's the way they're thinking about the problem that starts inching over to becoming more and more of a co-created enterprise. But again, this would be between teacher-generated and co-created. On the second visual that you see, where trade students are actually creating something for their local habitat. They're building a house. This to me is, again, moving from a co-created to a student-generated experience, depending on the sophistication of the students involved. And the idea is that even when we're in the student-generated space, it's still anchored on quality criteria. That's incredibly important, especially when you're building a house, right? So the idea is that we're doing it not only in accordance with certain construction standards, we're also doing it in accordance with how we're thinking and planning out what has to happen first and what has to happen next. So even when it's on a student-generated space, again, it's not totally unmoored. The next example I wanted to share with you is the Brainado example that comes from Crosset Brook Middle School in Duxbury, Vermont. And I think this is the third year that this school has been engaged in this. So when you're looking at the kinds of examples, and again, there's a super cool video on the landing page on learningpersonalized.com where the kids did like a preview or a highlight reel of the examples that happened in the year before. And the idea and the inspiration of Brainado is really trying to take Genius Hour and the idea of Genius Hour and play that out into something that the entire school is getting into the spirit of it. So this is something, and again, you'll also see the 10-session lesson plan that's posted right underneath the Brainado example. But there are a couple of concrete examples that I thought were fabulous. So the idea of the hoverboard was one great example. The other opportunity that I thought was really interesting was students were looking at a dehydrator to use and prepare backpacking meals. There are other examples like a scale model of an Earthship house, or a mechanic who opened up his shop for students who wanted to learn that particular trade. But the opportunity to engage in that experience really starts pushing the needle or pushing the lever into that student-generated moment. Like I said, it's grounded in criteria. The picture that you see is an example of a free soccer clinic that students engaged in, but they also consulted with students the year before for those ones that hosted a basketball clinic. So those are a couple of concrete examples that are already happening in real time in the state of Vermont. I saw another fabulous example, and Katie referred to it in one of the blog posts that I put on Learning Personalized as well, the idea of iLead. So this comes from Rumney Memorial in Vermont, and these are some of the job ideas that were drafted by students and staff. Take a quick read. And the spirit of iLead is that students have an opportunity to engage with the help of learning and leading within the school itself. So there were a group of sixth graders that were interviewed. And again, I'm just going to read off a couple of their responses. So it made me want to come to school more. I knew that the first and second graders depended on me to help them play safely and include others at recess. Another student said, being able to teach young students in one of my favorite subjects makes me feel amazing. And to try to start to see that level of confidence and competence growing in older students because they feel value, but also there is a depth of thinking and problem solving and troubleshooting that they have to do when they're engaging with younger peers in these particular examples. So the cool part about being a reading hero or a media ninja, I mean, the magic of even the titles are inspiring. If I'm a global education advocate, what am I doing as part of that school? And so even if you're just taking a look at these iLead job ideas, many of these can actually influence the work that's happening in your particular school. I wanted to feature the other example of Shelburne Community School. And just to start to get in the spirit of how do we actually help students as they're moving through this process? People love to see a couple of tools, and this is, I think, one fabulous tool. I know the example of the Brain to Do with that lesson plan is another way of thinking about a scope and sequence of how we structure it in a way that is helpful for students and teachers to plan out and organize. But this particular example from Shelburne really is trying to clarify what is it that you want to learn about and how might I demonstrate that learning. And when you're trying to think about and play this out, I wanted to one more time clarify that there are two territories when it comes to student-led assessments. One territory, and unfortunately that territory takes up much of the airspace in classrooms, is managing the project. Managing the project means that we need to keep on top of them to make sure they're going to get to the finish line. And I will absolutely say that it's incredibly important, but it's not the only or most important thing. So managing the project is important when it comes to checkpoints. I need to see progress along the way as a classroom teacher. And checkpoints can actually be done through written statements. I can see outlines, for example. I can see action steps and the results of those action steps. But I also can see that in one-on-one conferences. So the opportunity to sit down and understand and appreciate where a student or a group of students are and how can I not only help offer suggestions or networking opportunities, but also how can I continue to troubleshoot to make sure that the challenge or the project is going to be done on time. The third piece in terms of managing the project that's really helpful is for kids to actually have the opportunity to engage in action planning tools. So Slack, for example, is a fabulous action tool where it's a network of individuals that have immediate access to one another. There are lots of other old school or technology-based experiences like Trello, for example. And so the idea is that if we can continue to get them open to using those tools, a classroom teacher actually can be part of that community to continue to monitor student work, but also to observe the thinking as well as ask just-in-time reflecting and probing questions to help that. But the other aspect that I continue to point to is the idea of growing their thinking. And you'll start to see that the first two are exactly the same. When we're growing their thinking and when we're coming up with a checkpoint, we want to make sure that it goes way beyond filling out a form. And oftentimes many checkpoints are just that. How can we continue to include a level of problem identification as they're moving through this particular challenge? So trying to make sure that the level of deep thinking and analysis is present when they're engaged in the research phase. Trying to make sure that they are paying attention to fine-tuning language. That's really what the checkpoints hopefully are trying to do. So the notion of archiving different iterations is another really powerful checkpoint. Different snapshots, and again, snapshot literally could be a physical snapshot, or a snapshot could be growing an idea in writing. All of that is demonstrating a level of progress monitoring. So hopefully what we're seeing in that third or that fourth checkpoint is really much further along than what that first checkpoint envisioned. The one-on-one conferences, again, are a really powerful way to have students continue to grow their thinking, especially when students come with a prepared mind. And I think I shared some examples in webinar 2, but I also can post an example or two or share an example or two when I'm with you all in May. To really show what a prepared mind looks like. So when it comes to a conference, just because I have a time slot with you as a classroom teacher doesn't mean that I'm ready for that. And really trying to give a set of questions for students to contemplate and provide or collect evidence of, so they sit down with you with your precious time with a one-on-one conference to make sure it's as effective as possible. And then finally, the notion of reflection tools. Reflection tools, again, whether you're engaged in using these in a Google Classroom or you're getting them used to the idea of journaling, it's very important for them to continually reflect, to not only identify areas of challenge and strength, but also reflect on areas where they're proud of the phrase that they finally cultivated, or an aspect of an idea. So reflection is not only going to be on the quality of the ultimate results. Reflection also really is about the level of thinking and imagining and struggle that engaged in the project. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what a student-led assessment is. And the last part of the presentation is we're going to move into the thorny idea of evaluation. And evaluation, especially when you're engaged in student-led assessments, what does that actually look like? This is one of the things that many classroom teachers that chat with me around the country are really struggling with this, especially when they feel like if every student is doing something different, to what extent do I have to design a different rubric for each project or each student? And I don't know about you, but writing rubrics, writing quality rubrics is not an easy task. So let's take a look at what we mean by evaluation. And again, if I can indulge you in reading from left to right. So as you're doing a deep read from left to right, you'll start to understand, and what hopefully is revealed to you is that there are two real territories for evaluation when it comes to students having a role as partners with us. The first part, as you start to see in the front half of the teacher and student co-created, is that the student actually has an increased role in defining the criteria or understanding and clarifying on what it looks like. So there are a couple of different ways to go after that, and we'll address that in the next slide. The second thing that you should notice is that second half of the co-created statement, as well as the student-generated statement, is the student to have a place or a role at the judging table. And again, to engage in this does require a fair bit of conferencing, and it also does require a level of transparency of what are the criteria by which the students are going to be judged. And those criteria should be accessible and appropriate given the student or students in front of you. So let's talk about when students have a role in the development and clarification of the criteria. And what you're starting to see and what on your screen are the 4 attributes coming right back again. So when you're thinking about the 4 attributes in that development piece, we're trying to go after the idea that students, once they own the criteria, and that's the entire point of this, once they own the criteria, they're connected to that as a measuring stick for themselves. So they're working toward that performance expectation, and they're also engaged in asking probing questions for you to continue to help them think through and make that performance standard mark. So from a voice point of view, the opportunity for students to be able to look at the criteria and start to think about what does this criteria look like at different levels of quality. Co-creation is the opportunity to draft that language or draft that visual or actually take samples and line them up into effective score points. Social construction is the conversation they're having in small groups or one-on-one or as a whole class of what does quality mean? What does quality look like? And why is that so significant in relation to this particular form? And finally, self-discovery is that what am I learning about myself as I'm moving from one score point to another? So it has to feel like it's still accessible for me, but also I'm having a clearer appreciation as a student that it's something that I have an opportunity to continue to grow in. So that's the territory of the development and clarification of criteria. So I want to share a concrete example. This is an example that came from a local school district in Connecticut, and it's a health-related example. So the idea of these 4 bullets, if you had an opportunity to read down, these 4 bullets are territory that can become criteria so that it's, again, I want to continue to clarify, it's not totally unmoored. So what these health teachers wanted is having the students understand and research the seriousness of the disease or condition. The second part is that they're engaged in thinking about preventative measures. What can we do to make it so this may not happen to you? Or potentially, if preventative measures aren't appropriate in this scenario, starting to think about healthy ways of coping. So how can I continue to offer support to the loved ones is that last piece. So really trying to think about a level of deep knowledge that this student-led assessment triggers, but also really trying to think about what can I do to help. One of the ways they can do to help is starting to ask questions in terms of doctors or medical professionals or social workers, but also really trying to be compassionate and spending time with somebody without doing it in a way that may not make them feel comfortable. And by the way, it's this particular example is so lovely because it's the power of the blank space. So you're deeply worried about blank. And again, when you're looking at the power of the blank space, potentially every single one of you might have a different thing to put in that blank space because it's something that impacts you or your family or a loved one. So I worry about diabetes. Another friend might worry about breast cancer. And really trying to think about and pay attention to the reality is that many times this is a real place for students to do a deep dive in something that they're desperately worried about. And the opportunity to engage in a substantive research experience grounded in something that they're worried about continues to make sure that we're working on identifying valid and reliable sources, but we're also engaging them in deep reading and analysis and really trying to learn how to synthesize and draw conclusions. So it's not just a health experience, but it's also a research experience, and it's also a writing or a speaking and reflection experience. But when it comes to the last part of students having a role at the judging table, one more time, take a look at how the 4 attributes might impact their inclusion in that space. So we really need to understand and appreciate what the student was attempting to do, what students were trying to do. And that level of context may or may not be reflected in the student work. The second part is co-creation, really trying to have students describe what they think as the mark on a given criteria based on evidence that they're providing. And like I said, evidence actually can be not just in that product or that final product itself, but the iterations and the artifacts along the way. So we're really trying to think about evaluation as a cumulative experience as opposed to just a summative product one. Social construction is the act of sitting at a judging table together. So the notion of teacher and student really calling through those artifacts and examples in the final product, and they're making a decision in relation to the criteria and the descriptions of the criteria that are before them. And self-discovery, students will actually really have an opportunity now to think about challenges and struggles that they may acknowledge, during that judging moment that they still haven't figured out yet. The opportunity then to identify goals and next steps is incredibly impactful, especially if it's coming from them. So I wanted to share, as we wind down the session, 2 really interesting and lovely examples that I've had the pleasure to facilitate along the way. This first one is coming from Newport News, Virginia. It's a problem solution rubric for mathematics, grades 2 through 5. And I would love for you just to take a read for a moment, even if you're just reading one row. So when you're trying to take a look at this, all of a sudden you're starting to see that this is not a typical rubric. The first part, hopefully, you're starting to see is the puzzle pieces. And the idea of it being visual in nature really helps, especially when you're working with English language learners. The second part is that it is written in student-friendly language. And the idea of trying to write a learning goal in that first column, language that students can continue to understand and appreciate. They can also start to see, as they're moving through from novice to emerging to proficient, that they can start to see how the puzzle pieces are coming together. So oftentimes many rubrics have their level 1 score point being incredibly negative. And oftentimes the idea that if I'm novice, if I have a legitimate starting point, I have something that's worth marking. So the notion of really trying to celebrate what has been done so far, but also to create and grow from that experience. When you're thinking about the challenge of how this rubric's used, this rubric is actually can be designed for lots and lots of problems or projects because it's topic neutral. So when you're thinking about this, especially in relation to a typical question, how do teachers have time to do one-on-one conferences? Really starting to think about this as a, part of a conference where they're starting to see growth over time. Ideally, if the rubric doesn't change significantly, then the students can continue to improve and get better on the rubric based on their increased sophistication of their ability to have a plan to solve the problem. And yes, you can see that is a grade level band rubric from grades 2 through 5 because it's something that the math becomes more sophisticated, but this problem solving rubric actually has a level of sophistication that is entirely appropriate in that space. So the other example that I wanted to share with you is this example of speaking and listening. And it's the same idea, trying to be as student friendly as possible. So this is a speaking rubric, and this speaking rubric is designed to clarify one important topic at a time. The speaking rubric is designed for grades 5 through 9. And again, hopefully you understand and appreciate the personalization of it. Because when you're evaluating my speaking, it's my work, my thinking, my contribution, my voice, and trying to make sure that we understand and appreciate as classroom teachers that sometimes it's a highly personalized endeavor in terms of kids feeling sometimes under attack or kids sometimes not appreciating what constructive criticism looks like. So the topic alone, ideas and content, organization, word choice, was something that many teachers, when we were designing this, felt that was still a little too theoretical, especially when you're working with a grade 5 or a grade 6 student. So they actually drafted reflective questions underneath each one. And like I said, when you're trying to think about this as a grade level band enterprise, now all of a sudden you're starting to see that the opportunity to continue to get better at what quality speaking looks like, it is topic neutral. It also can be used in multiple subject areas, or you could use it for the end of a Genius Hour project, or you could use it at the end of a Brain and Do experience, and trying to make sure that you have clarity on what the criteria look like, but also how students can continue to provide opportunity and experience for demonstrating growth over time. So this is the last slide of the slide deck, and this is hopefully the moral of the story. So as we're starting to move into this contemporary learning space where teachers and students are working more as partners, first and foremost, both students and staff have to become increasingly more self-directed. They're starting to take responsible risks as they start pursuing their own ideas. And again, when you're engaged in both being more self-directed and pursuing your own ideas, you're doing it very much responsible to the key parameters. So hopefully you've got one of the messages is that the evaluation piece continues to clarify and restrict that we want to make sure that it does demonstrate a level of rigor, but also a level of connection to the state frameworks. When you're looking at building networks and connections to seek out and share ideas, this is something that many classroom teachers are already engaged in. Whether you as a classroom teacher are hanging out on Twitter and you're looking at what the Tarrant Institute is engaged in, or you're looking at one or two of the blog posts that Katie did that are posted on the landing page. Reach out to her. The idea of trying to seek out and share examples is incredibly important. So in this virtual age, a lot of that is happening, especially in Vermont. And I am so thrilled to be with you all face to face in person. Thinking about an iterative process, I think when it comes to these student-led assessments, both in the design of the parameters in response to what teachers are imagining in terms of reasonable, worthy, and rigorous projects, but also really trying to make sure that your first or your second iteration may not be that amazing experience that we sort of imagined in our heads, or what we imagined as we started to sketch it out. And so the idea of trying to design something that's powerful and productive and engaging, but also get students in the mix of giving feedback on what can we do to continue to improve this. So the notion of iteration, as much as we can include the students in reflecting on the learning in real time, continues to help make the next time better, whether it's next time is the next day or the next semester or the next year. And finally, reflecting on learning. The heart of all of this is really trying to grow students' capacity to understand who they are, what their strengths are, what their aspirations are, what they're passionate about, what they're interested in. And not only doing that, but doing it in a way that's connected to their next level of problem solving, critical thinking, creating, imagining, and innovating. So as we come to a close, hopefully that gives you an insight into what personalizing is in relation to student-led assessments.
All right, thank you, Allison, so much. We're excited to meet with you on May 2nd and 3rd, and we're going to post this video on our YouTube channel, and we'll have information about how to register for the events if you haven't already.
Well, I am so pleased to have been spending time with you virtually, and looking forward to seeing you in spring. And again, Carissa indicated the landing page, thelearningpersonalized.com, in the chat box. So if you didn't pick that up in the beginning, that would be a great idea to do before the end. And I will see you soon. Have a fabulous weekend.